She didn't know who he was. She thought he was just a lonely cripple, forgotten by the world in a rundown apartment at the end of the hallway. Every night, she knocked on his door carrying a steaming bowl of porridge. Every night, she sat beside his old wheelchair, telling him about her exhausting day, as if he were just an ordinary friend. She had no idea the pitiful man before her could buy the entire building she lived in, with just one phone call. She didn't know the men threatening her family would be begging for their lives on their knees if he wished. But what she could never imagine was that for the first time in 33 years, the man who made all of Chicago tremble was longing to be loved. Not for his power, not for his money, but for who he truly was. And she was the only one who could give him that, because she was the only one who didn't know what he had. This is a story of darkness finding light, of a monster learning to love, and of an ordinary girl who made an entire empire bow. If you want to know how the most powerful man in Chicago learns to love, stay until the end. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that touches the soul. But this story didn't begin with the bowl of porridge. It began on a night when Tristan Wolfe lost everything. 3 months earlier, Tristan's mansion stood in stately silence on the outskirts of Chicago. Warm golden light spilled from the large glass windows, blending softly with the gentle sound of jazz drifting out from the living room. That night, Tristan had just returned from an upper-class party with Celeste, the woman who had been by his side for the past 3 years. He loosened his tie and stepped into the familiar room with that rare feeling of peace. Celeste walked in behind him, the heels of her shoes tapping lightly against the wooden floor, her smile still lingering from the evening's party. Tristan stood before the wide window and looked out into the inky darkness of the garden beyond. He didn't notice Celeste moving closer from behind. Her arm slipped gently around his waist, and her cheek rested against his back. Her warmth made Tristan's shoulders relax. She whispered into his ear, her voice sweet as honey. "Do you know how much I love you?" Tristan smiled faintly and laid his hand over hers. He didn't answer, but his silence was an answer in itself. He placed his absolute faith in her. He believed in the 3 years they shared, cherished the nights she lay beside him, and clung to every whispered promise of love. Celeste kept whispering, "I'll always stay by your side. You know that, don't you?" Tristan gave the slightest nod. He didn't know that those were the last lies he would ever hear from her lips. Celeste turned him around and looked straight into his eyes with a gaze he had believed was love. She rose onto her toes and pressed a kiss to his mouth. It was warm and tender, like every kiss before it. But before her lips had even left his, a deafening blast tore through the silence. Tristan's shoulder went numb in an instant. His body lost its balance and collapsed onto the freezing wooden floor. He didn't understand what was happening. His head spun, and all the strength in his body seemed to drain away in only a few seconds. He looked up, and what he saw made his heart turn to ice. Celeste stood there without a single tear, without the slightest trace of panic. Beside her was a stranger, his hand still raised. Celeste looked down at Tristan, and the smile on her lips was so cold it was horrifying. She tilted her head as though admiring a work of art that had just been completed. "I'm sorry, my love," she said, her voice untouched by regret, "but your money is more attractive than you are. I hope you understand." Tristan tried to open his mouth, but not a sound came out. All he could do was lie there and watch the woman he loved turn her back on him and walk away, her hand tightly clasped in someone else's. Chaos erupted from outside. The front door was kicked open, and Knox stormed in like a hurricane, followed by his loyal security team. Knox's eyes swept across the room, saw Tristan lying on the floor, and understood at once what had happened. "Get them!" Knox shouted, but Celeste and her accomplice had already vanished through the back door and disappeared into the night. Knox didn't go after them. He dropped to his knees beside Tristan and lifted his head. "Tristan, can you hear me? You're going to be all right. I'm getting you somewhere safe." Tristan didn't answer. His eyes were still open, but the look in them was already dead. Knox signaled to the security team, and they quickly carried Tristan out of the mansion that was sinking deeper into chaos. In the car, Tristan lay motionless on the back seat, staring at the ceiling without blinking. Knox sat beside him, checking his condition again and again. "You're going to be all right," Knox repeated, his voice struggling to stay calm. "I've called the doctor. You're going to be all right." Tristan didn't react. A long while later, his lips finally moved, and his voice came out hoarse, like something drifting back from the land of the dead. 3 years, Knox. She was with me for 3 years. Knox said nothing. He didn't know what he could possibly say. Tristan closed his eyes, not because of the physical pain. The wound in his shoulder could heal, but the wound in his heart, where trust had just been crushed into pieces, would perhaps never heal at all. That night, Tristan Wolfe didn't just lose his faith, he lost even the ability to trust anyone ever again. The blinding white light was the first thing Tristan saw when he opened his eyes. He blinked several times, trying to bring his vision into focus. A stark white ceiling, the sharp smell of antiseptic, the steady rhythm of medical machines sounding in his ears. He was lying in a hospital bed, his body so heavy it felt as though stones had been tied to it. He tried to move, but a searing pain in his left shoulder made him clench his teeth. Then he turned his head and saw Knox sitting there, his back against the chair, deep shadows under his eyes from too many sleepless nights. When he saw Tristan awake, Knox sat up straight and let out a breath of relief. "You've been asleep for 3 days," Knox said, his voice rough and hoarse. "Welcome back to the world of the living." Tristan didn't answer. He stared up at the ceiling as the memory of that night came crashing back over him like a brutal wave. Celeste's kiss. The gunshot. Her cold smile. 3 years. All of it had been nothing more than a performance that had lasted 3 years. The door to the room opened, and a middle-aged man in a white coat walked in. Tristan's private doctor, the only one Knox trusted in a situation like this. He checked the readings on the machines, then turned to Tristan with a grave expression. "The blood loss and trauma have left your body extremely weak. You'll need to use a wheelchair to avoid any physical strain that could reopen the wound. Trying to exert yourself too soon will only make things worse." Tristan heard him, but said nothing. A wheelchair. He, Tristan Wolfe, the man who had made all of Chicago bow its head, would now be sitting in a wheelchair. When the doctor left, Knox pulled his chair closer and lowered his voice. "There's something you need to know," he said. "Celeste didn't act alone. She was working with Marcus Webb." Tristan frowned slightly. Marcus Webb, his biggest rival in the underworld, the man who had wanted to bring him down for a long time but had never had the chance. Knox went on. "After that night, we let word spread that you had died. All of Chicago believes it. The papers reported it, your enemies celebrated, and some have already started fighting over your territory." Tristan stayed silent, but his eyes darkened. Knox looked at him, then continued, "I know what you're thinking, and I think this could be an opportunity. They think you're dead. You can investigate without anyone suspecting a thing. You can find out who was really behind all of this." Tristan stared at the ceiling for a very long time without speaking. The room sank into a heavy silence. Then at last, he spoke, his voice low and cold as ice. "Then I'll die. I'll keep being dead until I find out who was behind Celeste. Until I know exactly who deserves my revenge." Knox nodded, as if he had expected that answer all along. "I've already prepared a place," he said. "An apartment in the South Side, somewhere no one would ever suspect. I'll station men in secret around the area. You'll be safe there." 2 weeks later, an ordinary car stopped in front of an old building in the poorest neighborhood in Chicago. Knox helped Tristan into the wheelchair and pushed him toward the rattling elevator. The apartment was on the 4th floor, at the end of a dim hallway. When the door opened, Tristan looked around at his new place. The walls were cracked and stained, with paint peeling away in patches. The ceiling light flickered as though it might die at any moment. The only furniture was a narrow bed, an old wooden table, and a plastic chair. Tristan sat in the middle of the room in his wheelchair, looked around, then let out a quiet laugh. That bitter sound echoed through the cramped space. "From a mansion of 1,000 square meters to this," he said, his voice edged with mockery. "Life really does know how to make a joke." Knox stood by the door, watching him with worried eyes. "This is the safest place for now," he said. "No one's going to look for a kingpin in a neighborhood like this, and I'll have men posted in secret positions all around. One will pretend to be the building's security guard, another will pose as a neighbor. You're never truly alone, even if it looks that way." Tristan didn't answer. He turned his wheelchair toward the window and looked outside. The view was a maze of old, crowded buildings, tangled electrical wires, and a gray sky hanging low above everything. It was nothing like the view from his mansion, where he could look out and see the whole city at his feet. But now he was only a man in a wheelchair, living in a run-down apartment, forgotten by the world. Tristan Wolfe was dead in the eyes of the public. But in that wretched apartment, someone else was waiting to be born. At the same time, in another corner of Chicago, there was a young woman fighting her own battle with life in her own way. Rosalie Chen, 27 years old, stood in the cramped kitchen of a small restaurant, sweat covering her forehead, her hand never stopping as she worked the pan. She had been working since 6 o'clock in the morning, and now it was almost 11 o'clock at night. The smell of grease, the sizzling of food, and the manager's shouting blended together into a familiar symphony of chaos. "Rosalie! Table 7 has been waiting for 15 minutes already. Why are you moving as slow as a turtle?" The manager's shrill voice rang out from behind her. Rosalie didn't turn around. She only answered softly, "Yes, it's almost ready." She lowered her head and endured it, her hands still moving quickly as she arranged the food on the plate. She had no right to argue back, no right to complain. She needed this job. She needed every small bit of pay to cover her mother's hospital bills, to save enough money to bring her younger sister home. A coworker passed by and whispered to someone else, "She's working 3 shifts in a row. I heard her mother is seriously ill, and her younger sister is being held somewhere because of some debt their uncle left behind when he ran away." Rosalie heard it, but pretended she hadn't. She was used to the whispers, used to the looks of pity. She didn't need pity. She only needed enough strength to make it through today. Close to midnight, Rosalie got off work. She didn't go home right away, but ran straight to the hospital. Her legs were aching with exhaustion, but she still moved quickly through the silent hallways until she stopped in front of a room at the very end. Her mother, Margaret, lay in the hospital bed, her body as thin as a dry leaf, the breathing machine making its soft, steady sound. Rosalie pulled up a chair and sat beside her, gently taking her mother's hand in hers. It was bony and cold, but it still tried to squeeze her daughter's hand. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at her daughter with a gaze that was weak but full of worry. "My girl," she said in a frail voice, "don't worry so much about me. I'm old now. Life and death happen as they're meant to. Take care of Willa. She's still young. She still has her whole future ahead of her." Rosalie pressed her lips together, trying to stop the tears from spilling over. Willa, her younger sister, 19 years old, was being held somewhere as collateral for the enormous debt their uncle had left behind when he disappeared. With each passing day, Rosalie lived in fear that her sister would be harmed. "Don't worry, Mom," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll take care of everything. You just need to get better. I promise." When she left the hospital, it was very late. Rosalie took the last bus back to the south side. Her new apartment was on the 4th floor of an old building. She had moved there only 2 weeks earlier, after being thrown out of her old place because she couldn't afford the rent. The room was tiny, just big enough for a narrow bed, a small table, and a few personal belongings. The walls were stained with damp patches, and the window creaked whenever the wind blew, but at least it was a place where she could lie down after long days of exhaustion. Rosalie opened the door, stepped inside, and turned on the light. A weak yellow glow fell across the bare room. She let out a tired sigh, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked around. This was her life now. There was nothing left to lose, and nothing left to fear. She only had to keep moving forward. Just as she was about to lie down, she happened to notice the apartment across the hallway. A faint light slipped through the crack beneath the door. Someone new had moved in. She didn't pay much attention, because her mind was far too tired to think about anything else. But from that night on, Rosalie began noticing the apartment across from hers more and more. On the first night, she heard the sound of coughing through the thin wall. It was a deep, heavy cough, as though the person was in serious pain. On the second night, the coughing continued. On the third night, it was the same. Rosalie tried not to care, because she already had too much to worry about. But by the 4th night, she realized something strange. She had never once seen the person in the apartment across the hall come outside. Not even once. Not to buy food, not to take out the trash, not to do anything at all. There was only that faint light and the sound of coughing in the night. On the 5th night, Rosalie lay on her bed, staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She thought about her mother. Her mother had always taught her that when you see someone else suffering, if you can help, then you should help. People suffer, and if there's something you can do, then do it, her mother used to say. Maybe that was why Rosalie could never turn away from another person's pain, even while she herself was drowning in hardship. On the 6th night, when the coughing came through again, Rosalie sat up. She looked toward the door, then made her decision. Tomorrow, She would cook a bowl of porridge and bring it over. She didn't know who that person was, and she didn't know whether they needed help. But she couldn't just lie there, listening to that cough every night, and do nothing at all. Rosalie Chen didn't know that on the other side of the hallway, the darkness was waiting for her light. On the 6th night, Rosalie returned to her apartment when the clock was already nearing midnight. Her body was drained after 3 straight shifts, and her legs felt ready to give out as she climbed each step of the staircase. She opened the door and stepped into the dark room, intending to collapse onto the bed, when the sound of coughing came again from the apartment across the hall. It was a heavy, drawn-out cough, the kind that sounded as though someone was trying to suppress it but couldn't. Rosalie stood still in the middle of the room and looked toward the wall separating the 2 apartments. Then she let out a quiet sigh, walked into her tiny kitchen, took out some rice, poured water into a pot, and began making porridge. She didn't have much to give, only a little rice and a few onions, but at least a hot bowl of porridge might help someone get through their hunger. When it was done, she ladled it into an old ceramic bowl, scattered a layer of fragrant fried onions on top, and carried the bowl outside. Rosalie stood in front of the door of the apartment across the hall, the bowl still steaming in her hands. She took a deep breath, then raised her hand and knocked. The sound echoed through the silent hallway. There was no response. She knocked again. Still silence. She was about to turn away when she heard a strange sound from inside, the rolling sound of wheelchair wheels moving across the floor. Then the door opened a narrow crack. Rosalie looked inside and saw a man sitting in a wheelchair. The hallway light fell across his face, revealing it fully. A sharply cut face, hard and angular as though carved from stone. Gray eyes looked at her from head to toe, so cold that she had the strange feeling the temperature in the hallway had just dropped by several degrees. He said nothing, only stared at her with an expression that seemed capable of freezing the whole world. Any ordinary person would have stepped back from a gaze like that. But Rosalie wasn't an ordinary person. She was used to being shouted at, looked down on, treated badly. A cold stare couldn't frighten her. "I live in the apartment across the hall," Rosalie said, her voice calm. "I've heard you coughing all week. Have you eaten anything yet?" Tristan looked at her and said nothing. He wasn't used to strangers knocking on his door, and even less used to someone showing concern for him without wanting something in return. "No need," he said, his voice flat and icy. "Go away." Rosalie didn't move. She looked down at the bowl of porridge in her hands, then back at him. "I already made this," she said. "If you don't eat it, should I just throw it out? That would be such a waste." Tristan lifted an eyebrow slightly. For the first time in a very long while, someone was speaking to him like this, without fear, without flattery, without calculation, simply with stubbornness. "I don't know you," he said, his voice still cold, but carrying something slightly different now. "You don't need to care about me." Rosalie shrugged. "I know," she answered, "but my mother taught me that when you see someone suffering, you help if you can, and you look." She stopped, tilted her head, and looked him up and down before continuing. "You look like you're suffering a lot." Tristan blinked. He had heard many things said about him, frightening, dangerous, cruel, powerful, but no one had ever said that he looked miserable. Before he could respond, Rosalie spoke again. "Fine. If you don't want to talk, I'm going home. But I'm leaving this porridge here. Whether you eat it or not is up to you." Then the door slammed shut in front of her. Rosalie didn't get angry. She only shrugged, bent down, placed the bowl neatly in front of the apartment door, then turned and walked back toward her own apartment. Her figure looked fragile beneath the weak yellow hallway light, her steps unsteady from exhaustion. From inside the apartment, Tristan looked through the narrow opening of the door and watched her walk away. He kept watching until she disappeared behind the door of the apartment across the hall. Then he looked down at the bowl of porridge sitting outside his door. Steam still rose from it in soft curls. He sat there for a long time, thinking, and at last he opened the door, bent down, and picked up the bowl. The smell of hot porridge and fried onions drifted gently into his nose. For the first time in many weeks, something warm touched him. Not the warmth of money or power, but something far simpler than that. He carried the bowl inside, set it on the table, stared at it for a long while, and only then began to eat. That night, after finishing the entire bowl of porridge, Tristan called Knox. "The girl in the apartment across the hall," he said. "Look into her." Knox was silent for a moment on the other end of the line, then asked, "Is she dangerous?" Tristan didn't answer right away. He thought about her fearless eyes, about the way she had said he looked like he was suffering a lot, about the bowl of porridge still warm on the table. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice dropping lower, "but she's unusual." Tristan didn't know it yet, but that bowl of porridge that night was the first stone cast into the frozen lake inside his heart. From that night on, Rosalie began a strange routine. Every evening, no matter how exhausted she was, she still cooked a bowl of porridge or something simple, then carried it across the hall and knocked on the door of the apartment opposite hers. And every evening, the door was slammed shut in her face. Tristan never accepted the food from her hands, never said thank you, and hardly even bothered to look at her for more than 3 seconds. But Rosalie didn't give up. She simply placed the bowl of food in front of the door, then returned to her own apartment. And every morning after that, when she opened her door to leave for work, the bowl outside the opposite apartment was always empty. She smiled each time she saw it. He could drive her away with words, but he was still eating the food she made. That was enough. Days passed, then weeks. By the 10th day, something strange began to happen. Tristan realized he was waiting. Every evening, when the clock neared 11 o'clock, he found himself looking toward the door, listening for footsteps in the hallway. When the knock finally came, he let out a quiet breath of relief, even though he still shut the door in her face as he always did. He didn't understand why. She was only a stranger, just an ordinary girl living in the apartment across from his. Why was he waiting for her? On the 14th day, Rosalie didn't come. Tristan sat alone in the dark apartment, staring at the door, waiting. 11 o'clock passed, 11:30, midnight. There was no knock, no footsteps in the hallway. The apartment across from his was silent, without even a light showing. He sat there, feeling a strange unease begin to rise inside him. Why hadn't she come? Had something happened to her? Then he grew angry with himself for thinking such things. She was only a stranger. He shouldn't care. He wasn't allowed to care. But he couldn't stop thinking about her. The phone rang. Knox was calling. "I have the results of the background check on the girl across the hall," Knox said, his voice even and controlled. "Her name is Rosalie Chen, 27 years old. She works as a cook in a small restaurant, pulling 3 shifts a day. Her mother is in the hospital with severe heart disease, and her younger sister, 19 years old, is being held hostage because of their uncle's debt. He borrowed money and ran off, leaving behind debt papers with their mother's signature as guarantor." Tristan stayed silent for a long time after hearing it all. He thought about that slender girl, about her fearless eyes, about the smile she still wore every time she knocked on his door. She was carrying so much on her shoulders, and yet she still brought food to a stranger every night. He said nothing. He only ended the call. The next evening, when the knock came at 11 o'clock, Tristan let out a quiet breath of relief. He rolled himself to the door and opened it. Rosalie stood there, a bowl of porridge in her hands, her smile still resting on her lips. But he noticed it at once. Her eyes were swollen and red, as though she had cried a great deal. "Sorry," she said, her voice slightly hoarse. "I was busy yesterday, so I'm making up for it today." She offered no further explanation. She didn't say that she had spent the whole previous night at the hospital beside her mother's bed, didn't speak of the phone call from the men holding her sister and threatening her, didn't mention the tears she had cried in the corner of the restaurant kitchen. She only stood there, smiling, as though everything were perfectly fine. Tristan looked at her for a long moment, then did something he had never done before. He opened the door all the way and said, "Come in. Don't stand out in the hallway like an idiot." Rosalie blinked in surprise. Then she smiled and stepped into the apartment. She looked around the small room, at the cracked walls, the flickering light, the sparse furniture. Anyone else would have shown pity, would have said things like, "Poor you," or "How can you live here?" But Rosalie didn't. She only glanced around once, then turned back to him with a calm expression. "This place is still better than my old apartment," she said lightly. "At least it doesn't leak. Every time it rained in my old place, I had to put buckets all over the room to catch the water." Tristan looked at her and said nothing. For the first time, someone had stepped into his space without looking at him with pity. She didn't ask why he was in a wheelchair, didn't ask why he lived alone, didn't ask who he was. She simply treated him like an ordinary person. Rosalie set the bowl of porridge down on the old wooden table, then turned to him. "Eat," she said. "It won't taste good once it gets cold." She didn't know what he carried inside him. And perhaps that was exactly what he needed. From that night on, everything began to change. Rosalie didn't just bring food anymore and then leave. She began to stay, sitting on the old plastic chair in Tristan's apartment, telling him about her long days. She told him without complaining, without crying, without asking for pity. She spoke as though she were talking about the weather, about the most ordinary things in the world. She told him about her work at the restaurant, about the manager who was always yelling, about the coworkers who whispered behind her back. She told him about her mother lying in the hospital, about the heart illness that kept getting worse, about the piling hospital bills she had no idea how she would ever pay. She told him about her uncle, her mother's younger brother, the man who had borrowed an enormous sum of money and then vanished without a trace, leaving behind debt papers bearing her mother's signature as guarantor. And she told him about Willa, her 19-year-old sister, the younger sister she had helped raise since childhood, who was now being held somewhere as a hostage to force her to repay the debt. Tristan sat in silence and listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, didn't offer commentary. He only sat there, watching the slender girl tell the story of her life in a voice so strangely calm. She was 27 years old, yet the weight on her shoulders was heavier than that of anyone he had ever known. Then Rosalie said something that made Tristan feel as though his heart had stopped. "I just need to save enough money," she said, her voice still as calm as if she were talking about grocery shopping, "about 2 more months. If I take a few extra shifts and cut every expense, I'll have enough. I'll bring my sister home." She said it as though it were the simplest thing in the world, as though working herself into exhaustion, going without food and comfort, gathering every last dollar and cent to buy her sister's freedom was something entirely normal. Tristan looked at her and said nothing. He thought about himself, about the days he had spent lying in this apartment, drowning in grief and hatred because he had been betrayed. He had money, power, everything people dreamed of, and yet he had still felt like a victim. But this girl had nothing at all, and she never once saw herself as a victim. She was carrying so much on her shoulders, and still every night she brought food to a stranger. She was strong in a way he had never seen in anyone before. A stretch of silence passed. Then Rosalie turned to look at him, curiosity in her eyes but not intrusion. "What about you?" she asked gently. "You live here alone. I never see anyone come visit. What happened to you?" Tristan didn't answer at once. He looked out the window, where the night sky was black and empty, without a single star. He hadn't spoken about himself to anyone in a very long time. He hadn't trusted anyone enough to do that. But with this girl, he didn't know why. He wanted to speak. "I once had everything," he finally said, his voice low and slow. "Then I lost everything, because I trusted the wrong person." He didn't give details. He didn't speak of Celeste, of that night, of the wound in his shoulder, or the wound in his heart. But that alone was enough. Rosalie nodded slowly, and didn't ask for more. She wasn't nosy, didn't demand to know more, didn't judge him. She only looked at him with quiet understanding, and then said softly, "Then you and I are the same. We're both trying to stand up again." Tristan looked at her, startled. No one had ever spoken to him that way. No one had ever placed themselves beside him as an equal, not out of fear or flattery, but out of genuine understanding. That night, after Rosalie returned to her own apartment, Tristan sat alone in the dark. He didn't turn on the light, didn't do anything at all, only sat there thinking about what she had said. For the first time in a very long while, someone had spoken to him as though he were an ordinary man, without fear, without flattery, without calculation. She didn't know who he was, didn't know what he had, and perhaps because of that, she could treat him that way. He picked up his phone and called Knox. "Where is her sister being held?" he asked the moment Knox answered. "Find that place, and find out who's keeping her there." Knox was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he asked, his voice carrying a trace of surprise, "You want to help her?" Tristan didn't answer right away. He looked toward the door, where only a few hours earlier Rosalie had been standing with a bowl of porridge in her hands. "I just want to know," he finally said, his voice trying to remain calm. Knox said nothing more, but both of them knew. Tristan was lying. He didn't just want to know. He wanted to help her. He wanted to do something for her, even though he didn't understand why. Tristan didn't realize it, but he had already begun to care about her, not because she was beautiful, but because she was strong in a way he had never seen before. 1 week after the night Rosalie told him about her life, everything began to grow worse. That evening, Rosalie came home later than usual. When the knock sounded, Tristan opened the door and knew at once that something was wrong. Her face was pale, her lips trembling slightly, and the hand holding the bowl of porridge wasn't steady the way it usually was. She tried to smile, but that smile couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. "Come in," Tristan said, rolling his wheelchair back so she could step inside. Rosalie set the bowl of porridge on the table, then sat down in the familiar chair. She was silent for a moment, as though trying to gather her thoughts. Tristan didn't ask. He simply waited. At last, Rosalie spoke, her voice shaking a little. "The debt collectors came to the restaurant today." Tristan frowned slightly. "What did they say?" Rosalie took a deep breath. "They gave me 1 more week. 1 week to come up with all the money. Or else." She didn't finish the sentence, but Tristan understood. Men who made money that way never threatened without meaning it. His hand tightened around the arm of the wheelchair, blue veins rising beneath the skin. Yet his voice remained calm. "What did they threaten to do to you?" Rosalie shook her head, trying to appear composed. "It doesn't matter. I'll find a way. I always do." She gave a faint smile, but Tristan could see the fear she was trying to hide. He said nothing more. He only nodded. But inside him, a decision had already been made. That night, after Rosalie returned to her apartment, Tristan picked up his phone and called Knox. "The debt collectors are threatening her," he said, his voice cold as ice. "I want it handled." Knox was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. "Handled how?" he asked. Tristan looked out the window at the black night beyond. "In a way that makes sure they never dare come near her again," he answered, his voice stripped of all emotion. "And Knox, I want that debt gone. Completely." Knox understood. He had followed Tristan long enough to know when not to ask more questions. "I'll take care of it," he said, and then he ended the call. 2 days later, in a dark room inside an abandoned industrial building on the south side of Chicago, the debt collectors stood in a line, their faces drained of color. In front of them were 3 men in black suits, their eyes cold and empty of feeling. These were Tristan's men, the kind of men no one in the underworld ever wanted to face. The leader of the debt collectors was shaking, his voice stumbling over itself. "Please, sirs, we didn't know she was connected to anyone. We were only collecting a debt the usual way. Please let us go." One of the men in black stepped forward and looked at him the way a man might look at a worm. "The debt," he said, his voice flat and merciless. "It's erased. From this day on, her family doesn't owe you a single dollar. And if any of you ever appear near her again, near her family, or even think about troubling her," he stopped and tilted his head as he looked at the man in charge, "you'll regret ever having been born." The man nodded frantically, cold sweat running down his forehead. Yes, we understand. It's gone. We'll never show up again. We swear." The man in black looked at him a moment longer, then turned and walked away. The debt collectors remained where they were, trembling, not daring to move until the others had completely left. The following evening, Rosalie came to see Tristan with an expression caught between shock and confusion. She knocked, stepped inside, then stood in the middle of the room looking at him with eyes full of questions. "Something really strange happened," she said, still sounding stunned. "The debt collectors called me this morning out of nowhere. They said the whole debt was erased. Completely. They don't want a single dollar." Tristan sat in his wheelchair with no expression on his face. "Is that so?" he replied calmly. "Good for you." Rosalie stared at him. "Don't you think that's strange? They threatened me just a few days ago, and now suddenly the debt is gone, and they're not asking for anything at all?" Tristan shrugged. "Maybe they're afraid of karma." Rosalie tilted her head slightly and looked at him with suspicion. "You believe in karma?" she asked. Tristan looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze softened just a little. "I do," he answered. "Karma always finds a way." Rosalie looked at him for a long moment, as though trying to read him. Then she laughed, a soft, gentle sound filling the small room. "You really are strange," she said, shaking her head. "A man in a wheelchair, living alone, knowing no one, and yet he believes in karma." Tristan didn't answer. He only watched her smile. He liked the sound of her laughter. It was warm, genuine, untouched by the falseness of the laughter he had heard for so many years. She didn't know it, but her karma was sitting right in front of her, in that worn old wheelchair. 2 weeks after the debt collectors disappeared, Rosalie's life seemed to have grown a little less crushing. She still worked from morning until late at night, still rushed to the hospital to see her mother every evening, still brought food to the man living in the apartment across the hall, but at least she no longer had to live in fear of the debt collectors. She didn't understand why they had suddenly erased the debt, but she had no time to dwell on it. She was simply grateful and kept moving forward. But fate had no intention of leaving her in peace. That night, the Chicago sky was black as ink. Heavy clouds rolled in and swallowed both moonlight and starlight. Then the rain came down. Not ordinary rain, but the kind that seemed determined to drown the whole city. Water poured from the sky in sheets. The wind howled in fierce bursts, and the streets were deserted because no one was foolish enough to go out in weather like that. Rosalie got off work later than usual. She stood at the back door of the restaurant, staring out at the white curtain of rain, and let out a tired sigh. She had no umbrella, no money for a taxi. All she could do was run. She pulled her coat over her head and threw herself into the storm, running toward her apartment. The shortcut near her building was the alley. Rosalie had walked through it hundreds of times. She knew every brick, every streetlight, every cracked piece of pavement. She didn't think much about it, only lowered her head and hurried into the dark alley. But tonight, something was different. She had made it halfway through when she suddenly stopped. Ahead of her, 3 figures emerged from the darkness and blocked her path. The flickering streetlight cast itself across their faces. They weren't the debt collectors. These men were strangers, dressed in black, their eyes cold and dangerous. Rosalie's heart began pounding wildly. She stepped back, rainwater streaming down her face. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though it trembled. "What do you want?" One of the 3 stepped forward and looked her up and down. "Are you Rosalie Chen?" he asked, his voice flat and cold. "The one who keeps going to the apartment of that crippled man on the 4th floor?" Rosalie froze. How did they know that? Who were they? Why were they watching her? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to step back again. But behind her, another figure had already appeared, cutting off her escape. She was surrounded. The 3 men moved closer. Rosalie tried to run, but her foot slipped on the wet pavement. She staggered, lost her balance, and fell hard onto the freezing ground. Rain soaked through her clothes at once, the cold sinking straight into her bones. At that exact moment, a figure appeared at the far end of the alley. Rosalie looked up, her eyes blurred by rain. She couldn't make him out clearly at first. All she saw was a tall shape moving toward them. Firm footsteps struck the wet ground, one after another, unhurried, but filled with menace. The 3 strangers turned and looked at the newcomer. Then the flickering streetlight flared once more, and Rosalie saw him clearly. Tristan, but not the Tristan she knew. There was no wheelchair. He was standing tall, broad-shouldered, moving with strength and certainty. Rain ran down the sharp planes of his face, his eyes cold as ice, dark as a night without a moon. He no longer looked like a lonely, disabled man. He looked like death itself stepping out of the darkness. The 3 strangers seemed to realize something at once. One of them shouted, "It's him! He's alive!" But it was already too late. Tristan moved like wind, like darkness melting into darkness. Rosalie couldn't even see what happened clearly. She only heard the sounds of impact, the groans of pain, then the thud of bodies hitting the ground. In mere seconds, all 3 men were down, unable to resist. They lay there groaning in the rainwater, too terrified to move. Rosalie sat on the ground while the rain kept crashing down, but she no longer felt cold. All she could do was stare at the man standing before her, her eyes wide with disbelief at what she had just seen. Tristan turned to look at her. Rain ran down his face, but his eyes were no longer cold the way they had been when he faced the 3 men. There was something else in the way he looked at her now. Worry, concern. "You," Rosalie stammered, her voice shaking. "You can stand? You're not disabled?" Tristan looked at her for a long moment, then spoke, his voice low and slow. "I never said I couldn't stand. You assumed that." Rosalie blinked, not knowing how to react. Everything she thought she knew about this man seemed to collapse in a single moment. The wheelchair, the miserable apartment, the loneliness, all of it had only been an act. Tristan stepped closer and held out his hand. It was a large, steady hand, unshaken even with the storm still pouring down around them. "Get up," he said. "Go home. Now." Rosalie looked at his hand, then lifted her eyes to his face. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what was happening. But in that moment, in the middle of that violent rainstorm, she chose to trust him. She placed her hand in his and let him pull her to her feet. And in that storm-soaked night, Rosalie Chen realized one thing. She had never truly known who that man was. Tristan led Rosalie out of the alley, walking through the rain toward the apartment building. He didn't say anything, and neither did she. There was only the sound of the rain falling and their footsteps striking the wet pavement. When they reached the apartment, Tristan opened the door and stepped inside. But Rosalie stopped at the threshold, unable to make herself go any farther. She stood there, her clothes soaked through, rainwater dripping onto the floor, looking at him with eyes full of confusion and questions. The man standing before her was no longer the man in the wheelchair she had grown used to over so many weeks. He was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered, steady on his feet, and there was a coldness in his gaze she had never seen before. "Who are you?" Rosalie finally asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you pretend to be disabled? Why are you living here? Who were those men? Why did they know about me?" The questions poured out of her like a flood, because there was too much she didn't understand. Tristan stood in the middle of the room, his back turned to her, silent for a long time. Then he turned around and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You want to know who I am?" he asked, his voice low and slow. "I'm the kind of man that, if you'd known sooner, you never would have knocked on my door. You would have run as far away as you could." Rosalie swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "I don't understand," she said. "Explain it clearly." Tristan looked at her, his eyes growing darker. "I'm darker than anything you could imagine," he said. "You thought I was a poor disabled man? You thought I needed your help? You were wrong. Completely wrong." Rosalie wanted to ask more, but at that moment, the apartment door opened. Knox stepped inside, his clothes soaked with rain as well. He looked at Rosalie, then at Tristan, and immediately understood the situation. Knox moved to stand beside Tristan, then turned to Rosalie. His gaze was cold, but not cruel. "You're speaking to Tristan Wolfe," he said, his voice even, as though he were reading the evening news. "The man who controls the entire underground financial system in Chicago. Every major transaction in the criminal world of this city passes through his hands. Every gang, every organization knows that name, and every one of them fears it." Rosalie stepped back until her back touched the doorframe. Her legs felt weak, as though the ground beneath her were giving way. You're, she stammered, unable to finish. Tristan looked at her without looking away. "Yes," he said, his voice without emotion. "I'm what people call a monster. The darkness. The nightmare of anyone foolish enough to stand against me." He paused for a second, then went on. "Now you understand. Now you know who I am. You can run, like everyone else." A heavy silence settled over the room. Rosalie stood there, trembling, but not from the cold. She looked at Tristan, looked at Knox, then back at Tristan. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. She should run. She should turn around and never look back. That was what any ordinary person would do. But Rosalie didn't run. She stood there, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks, mingling with the rain still clinging to her face. She didn't know whether she was crying from fear, from shock, or from something else entirely. "Then why?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why did you save me? Why did you make my debt disappear? If you're what you say you are, why do you care about a girl like me?" Tristan didn't answer right away. He turned his face away and looked out the dark window. The rain was still pouring outside, its steady sound like the whispering of the night itself. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice lower now. "And that's the problem. I don't know why I care about you. I shouldn't care, but I do." Knox stood beside him in silence, watching. He had never seen Tristan like this, never seen his boss admit weakness in front of anyone. Rosalie stood there for a long moment, tears still falling. Then she spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "I need time. I need to think." She didn't wait for Tristan to answer. She turned and walked out of the apartment. Her footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, then faded away. Tristan stood motionless, watching until the door of the apartment across the hall closed behind her. Knox remained beside him and finally spoke. "You're just going to let her leave like that?" Tristan didn't answer. He only stood there, staring at the closed door, and his eyes were no longer cold. There was something else in them now, something even he didn't understand. That night, Rosalie lay on her bed in her own apartment, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She thought about everything that had happened, about the man in the wheelchair, about the bowls of porridge, about the evenings they had spent talking, about the way he had saved her in the dark alley, about who he really was. She should have been afraid. She should have run. But when she thought of the way he had looked at her in the rain, she couldn't feel fear. She only felt her heart ache with something she couldn't name. That night, Rosalie couldn't sleep, not because she was afraid of who that man was, but because she was afraid of her own feelings. That night stretched on without end. Rosalie lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to fall asleep even though her body was completely exhausted. She tossed and turned, rolling from one side to the other, but her mind wouldn't stop spinning. She thought about the man in the apartment across the hall. Not Tristan Wolfe, the underworld boss Knox had described, but the man in the wheelchair she had come to know over so many weeks. She remembered the first time she knocked on his door, the way he looked at her coldly and then slammed the door in her face. She remembered all the times he sent her away, yet every morning the bowl of porridge outside his door was empty. She remembered the first time he invited her inside, the bluntness of his words that still carried no cruelty. She remembered those evenings in the small apartment, telling him about her life, and the way he sat in silence and listened without judgment. She remembered the look in his eyes when she spoke about Willa, the way something in them softened even though his face remained cold. And she remembered last night, the way he stood in the rain, his eyes filled with worry when he saw her fall to the ground. He had saved her. He had protected her. Whoever he was, whatever kind of past he carried, that didn't change. When the first light of morning slipped through the window, Rosalie had made her decision. She got up, went into the kitchen, and cooked a pot of porridge just as she always did. Her hands moved from habit, but her mind had never been clearer. She ladled the porridge into a bowl, then stepped out of her apartment and walked toward the door across the hall. She stood before the familiar door, the bowl still steaming in her hands. She took one deep breath, then raised her hand and knocked. A stretch of silence followed. Then footsteps came from inside, no longer the sound of wheelchair wheels. The door opened. Tristan stood there, without the wheelchair, tall and steady. He looked at her with stunned eyes, as though he couldn't believe she was standing there. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. Rosalie didn't answer at once. She stepped into the apartment, passed by him, and set the bowl of porridge down on the old wooden table. Then she turned back and stood facing him, looking straight into his eyes. "I know who you are," Rosalie said, her voice calm but certain. "I know you're dangerous. I know you control the underworld of Chicago. I know you can make people disappear with a single phone call." Tristan stood still and said nothing, waiting for her to continue. He had prepared himself for this moment, prepared himself for her fear, her disgust, her decision to run, like everyone else. But Rosalie didn't run. She kept speaking. "But I also know something else. You saved me last night. You made my family's debt disappear even though I never asked you to. You sit in this rundown apartment, pretend to be disabled, and eat the porridge I cook every night." She paused for a second, then continued, her voice softer now. "And you're lonely. I see that in your eyes every evening." Tristan gave a mocking laugh, but that laugh couldn't hide what was in his eyes. "You think I need your pity?" he asked, his voice edged with sarcasm. Rosalie shook her head. "No, I don't pity you. I think you need a friend. Someone who isn't afraid of you. Someone who looks at you and sees a person, not a monster." She stepped one pace closer, her gaze never leaving his. "You may be a monster to the whole world. You may be the darkness everyone fears. But to me," she said slowly, one word at a time, "you're just the man who likes hot porridge and never leaves a single bowl untouched when I set it outside your door." Tristan stood frozen, as if turned to stone. He had heard many things said about him in his life. Flattery, fear, hatred, but no one had ever spoken to him the way she did. Rosalie looked at him, her eyes bright but dry. "I'm not afraid of you, Tristan," she said. "There's only one thing I'm afraid of." "What?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I'm afraid you'll send me away." Silence filled the room. Tristan looked at her, and his eyes trembled like the surface of a lake struck by a stone. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. All his life, he had built walls around himself and never allowed anyone to step inside. But this girl had walked straight through those walls as though they had never existed. Then he laughed. Not the mocking laugh or the cold laugh he so often used, but a real one, the first real smile he had given in many years. "You really are reckless," he said, and there was a trace of warmth in his voice that surprised even him. Rosalie laughed too, her soft laughter filling the small room. "I know," she replied. "My mother says that too." Tristan looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and took her hand. His hand was large and warm, closing around her small one completely. "Then stay and have breakfast," he said. "You cooked the porridge. It's only fair that you eat it with me." Rosalie looked down at his hand holding hers, then lifted her eyes to meet his. She nodded. They sat down at the old wooden table and shared the hot bowl of porridge. The room was small, the walls cracked, the light flickering, but in that moment, it felt warmer than any place in the world. Before Rosalie left that day, Tristan did something he had never done for anyone. He took out a key and placed it in her hand. "Keep it," he said, "in case you need it." Rosalie looked at the key, then at him, understanding what it meant. This wasn't just the key to the apartment. It was trust. She closed her fingers around it and smiled. "I'll keep it." And for the first time, Tristan Wolfe no longer wanted to be alone. From that day on, everything between Tristan and Rosalie began to change. She still brought food over every evening, but now she stayed longer and talked more. Sometimes she remained until late at night, sitting on the old worn chair, telling him about her workday, about her mother in the hospital, about the bits of news she received from the people holding her sister. And Tristan listened. He didn't say much, but he listened. The key he had given her rested safely in her coat pocket, like a silent promise. One night, about 2 weeks after Rosalie learned the truth about Tristan, she returned to her own apartment later than usual. She had just come back from the hospital, exhausted to the bone, wanting only to sleep. She lay down on her bed, closed her eyes, and tried to empty her mind. But just as she drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, a scream tore through the silence of the late night. Rosalie jolted upright, her heart pounding wildly. The scream had come from the apartment across the hall, from Tristan. She didn't stop to think. She grabbed the key from the table and ran into the hallway. Standing in front of Tristan's door, her trembling hand pushed the key into the lock. The door opened to darkness. Rosalie stepped inside, her eyes straining to adjust. The screaming had stopped, but she could hear ragged breathing and low, broken sounds coming from the bed. She hurried toward it, and her heart tightened when she saw Tristan. He was lying there drenched in sweat, his sleep shirt soaked through. His eyes were shut tight, his eyelids twitching as though he were trapped inside a nightmare he couldn't escape. His lips moved, whispering words she couldn't quite make out. Rosalie sat down beside the bed and leaned closer to listen. Mom, don't go," he whispered, his voice full of pain, like the crying voice of a child. I'm sorry. Rosalie felt as if her heart were being squeezed in her chest. She gently placed her hand over his and held on tightly. "Tristan," she called softly, her voice tender. "Tristan, wake up. It's only a dream. Wake up." He didn't respond. He was still trapped in the nightmare. She tightened her hold on his hand and shook him gently. "Tristan, wake up." Suddenly he sat up, his eyes wide open, his breath coming fast and hard. He looked around in panic. Then his gaze landed on Rosalie. He blinked several times, as though he couldn't believe she was really there. "You, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rough and hoarse. Rosalie didn't let go of his hand. "I heard you screaming," she said softly. "You were having a nightmare." Tristan said nothing. He only sat there, staring down at her hand wrapped around his. A long silence passed. Then he spoke, his voice low and distant, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. "My mother died when I was 15 years old." Rosalie said nothing. She only listened. "She had heart disease," Tristan went on. "But heart disease wasn't what killed her. My father did." He stopped and drew in a deep breath. "My father was a cold, controlling man. He never laid a hand on my mother, but he controlled her in other ways. He controlled everything she did, everyone she saw, every word she spoke. She lived in fear every day, never daring to breathe too hard because she was afraid of displeasing him. He gave a bitter laugh. The doctor said my mother's heart got worse because she lived under stress for too long. Her body grew weaker and weaker because she was never allowed peace. Rosalie felt tears rise in her eyes, but she held them back and kept listening. I was holding her when she took her last breath, Tristan said, his voice almost a whisper. She looked at me, smiled, and said, "Live well, my son." Those were the last words she ever said. He looked down at his own hands, clenching them and then letting them go. I swore I would never become like my father. I swore I would become someone different. But look at me. He lifted his eyes, and there was pain in them so deep it seemed endless. I became something worse. I became the thing people fear. I became the darkness. Rosalie didn't speak for a while. She only sat there holding his hand, letting him say everything he had buried inside himself for so many years. Then she spoke, her voice gentle but steady. "You're not like him." Tristan looked up at her, confusion in his eyes. "He controlled your mother because he didn't know pain," Rosalie said. "He didn't know regret. He didn't know how to worry for someone else. But you're different." She squeezed his hand more tightly. "You saved me. You helped my family. You're lying here having nightmares about your mother after all these years. That's because you know pain, Tristan. That's because you have a heart." Tristan looked at her as though he wanted to believe what she was saying, but didn't dare. "You don't understand," he said. "You don't know what I've done." Rosalie shook her head. "I don't need to know," she answered. "I only know the man sitting in front of me right now. And you don't need to become perfect." She tilted her head and looked straight into his eyes. "You just need to stop being alone." Then she did something neither of them had expected. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him. Her embrace was small but warm, holding him the way one might hold a wounded child. Tristan froze for a moment, his body stiff because he wasn't used to tenderness. Then slowly, he relaxed, lowered his head onto her shoulder, and closed his eyes. That night, Tristan didn't have any more nightmares. For the first time in many years, he slept in peace, with her hand in his. In another corner of Chicago, in a luxurious penthouse overlooking the entire city, Celeste Montgomery was sitting at her vanity when her phone began to vibrate, a message from one of her confidential sources. She opened it, read it, and her face turned to stone. "Tristan Wolfe is still alive. He's hiding in the South Side." Celeste stared at the message, unable to believe what she was seeing. Alive. He was still alive. She had been certain that on that night he wouldn't survive. She had watched him fall to the floor, had seen his body lying motionless. She had celebrated with Marcus Webb, believing everything was over. But he was alive. And if he was alive, that meant she was in danger. Unless she acted first. Celeste looked at herself in the mirror, adjusted her perfect hair, then smiled. She knew exactly what she had to do. She had to see Tristan, had to win back his trust, had to seize her chance before it was too late. She had made him love her once. She could do it again. Or at least, that was what she believed. 2 days later, Celeste found Tristan's apartment address. She stood in front of the old building in the poor neighborhood and looked up at it with disgust. Tristan Wolfe, the man who had once lived in a mansion worth millions, was now staying in this slum. She took a deep breath, smoothed down the expensive dress she was wearing, then walked into the building. She climbed to the 4th floor, moved down the dim hallway, and stopped in front of the apartment at the very end. She raised her hand to knock, but noticed that the door was slightly open. She pushed it gently and stepped inside. The apartment was tiny, shabby, and sparsely furnished. And in the middle of the room, Tristan was sitting in a chair with his back to the door. He didn't turn around, as though he already knew she was there. "My love," Celeste said, her voice sweet as honey. "I found you. I'm so happy. I thought you had." She stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder, but Tristan rose to his feet and turned to face her. His eyes were cold as ice, without a trace of emotion. He looked at her as though she were a stranger. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice even. Celeste blinked, not expecting his reaction to be so cold. But she quickly regained her composure, her eyes reddening as tears rolled down her cheeks. Fake tears, of course. She had practiced that skill for a long time. "Please," she cried, her voice trembling. "I was forced. I had no choice. They threatened me. They said if I didn't cooperate, they would kill me. She stepped closer, trying to take his hand. I love you. I've always loved you. I was so afraid that night. I didn't know what to do. Please give me a second chance. I'll make it up to you. I'll stay by your side forever. Tristan stood still, watching her cry, watching the tears run down her cheeks. Then he spoke, his voice cold and empty of feeling. That night, you kissed me, he said slowly. Then the gunshot came. I fell to the floor, and you stood there, looking at me. He tilted his head and looked straight into her eyes. You smiled, Celeste. You smiled while you watched me fall. Celeste went pale, and the fake tears stopped at once. You misunderstood, she stammered. I didn't. You said my money was more attractive than I was. Tristan cut in, his voice without emotion. I remember it very clearly, every single word. At that exact moment, the apartment door opened. Rosalie stepped inside, a bag of food in her hand, the key still between her fingers. She stopped when she saw the scene in front of her. A strange woman, wearing an expensive dress and perfect makeup, was standing very close to Tristan, and Tristan was looking at that woman with eyes as cold as ice. Rosalie understood the situation at once. She walked in, set the bag of food down on the table, then stood there, calmly looking at the two of them. Celeste turned to Rosalie, her eyes moving from head to toe over her with a look of disdain. Simple clothes, hair tied back neatly, no makeup, hands still carrying the scent of food. Who are you? Celeste asked, her voice sharp and cold. The maid? Rosalie didn't get angry. She only smiled faintly, her expression calm. I'm the one who brings him porridge every night, she replied. And you? Rosalie tilted her head as she looked at Celeste. You're the one who brought him his wounds. Celeste froze, her eyes widening. She had never expected an ordinary girl like that to dare speak to her in such a way. She was about to answer back, but Tristan had already risen and walked over to stand beside Rosalie. Celeste, he said, his voice cold as ice. Get out, right now. Celeste looked at him, then at Rosalie, then back at him. You're choosing this girl? She asked, unable to hide the rage in her voice. A broke little cook? You're choosing her over me? Tristan didn't answer. He only looked at Celeste with empty eyes, as though she didn't even deserve a reaction from him. Don't ever appear in front of me again, he said, his voice completely without feeling. You died in my eyes that night, and the dead shouldn't come back. Celeste stood there for a moment, her face burning red with anger and humiliation. Then she turned and walked quickly out of the apartment, her high heels striking sharply against the floor. She didn't say another word, but as she passed Rosalie, she shot the girl a look full of hatred. Rosalie didn't step aside or look away. She only stood there, calm, meeting that gaze without fear. The door slammed shut. Celeste was gone. But as she descended the stairs, her face no longer held anger. Her lips curved into a cold smile, and her eyes lit with something dangerous. He had dared to reject her. He had dared to choose some poor cook over her. Fine. If she couldn't have Tristan Wolfe, then she would make sure no one else could have him either, especially not that girl with the porridge. Celeste walked away, but her eyes weren't the eyes of someone defeated. They were the eyes of someone plotting something even more cruel. That very night, Celeste went to see Marcus Webb, Tristan's greatest rival in Chicago's underworld. The secret meeting room in the old industrial district was lit by weak yellow light that fell across the faces of some of the most powerful people in the city. Marcus sat in his chair, watching Celeste walk in with an amused expression. I heard you failed, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Tristan Wolfe refused to die according to plan. Celeste showed no embarrassment. She sat down across from Marcus and smiled coldly. I was wrong to think I could get rid of him so easily, she admitted, but I discovered something else. Something that could be far more useful. Marcus arched a brow and waited. Tristan has a weakness, Celeste said, her eyes gleaming. A girl, some poor little cook. He cares about her. He really cares. She leaned forward. Use her. Tristan Wolfe has never had a weakness before. Now he does, and we're going to use it to destroy him. Marcus watched her for a long moment, then smiled. It was the smile of a predator who had just found prey. Interesting, he said. Very interesting. 3 days later, Rosalie got off work earlier than usual. She wanted to visit her mother at the hospital before it grew dark. She walked quickly through the familiar streets, her mind busy with what she wanted to tell her mother, with the thought that Willa would soon be free, with the brighter future that seemed to be waiting for her family. She didn't know that from the moment she left the restaurant, someone had been following her. She entered the hospital, walked to the elevator, and pressed the button. The doors opened, and she stepped inside. There were 3 people dressed as medical staff standing in the corner. She paid them no attention, only pressed the button for the floor where her mother's room was. The elevator doors closed, and that was when everything happened. One of the supposed medical workers stepped forward and blocked her way. Rosalie looked up, her heart beginning to beat faster. "Excuse me, is something—" She didn't get to finish. The other 2 had already moved. One blocked her from behind, while the other pressed a cloth over her nose. A sharp chemical smell flooded into her. Rosalie tried to fight, tried to scream, but her cry was smothered. She struggled, but her body was growing weaker. Her vision blurred. Then everything fell into darkness. When Rosalie woke, she found herself lying on an old mattress in a dim room. The window had been sealed shut, and only a weak lamp gave off any light. She tried to sit up, her head pounding as if it were being split apart. Then she heard a familiar sound, crying. She turned her head, and her heart nearly stopped. Willa, the young girl sitting in the corner, her eyes swollen red from crying, looked at her in terror. "Rosalie!" Willa ran to her and threw her arms around her, sobbing uncontrollably. "Rosalie, I'm so scared. They moved me here this morning. I don't know what's happening." Rosalie held her sister tightly, forcing herself to stay calm even though her heart was pounding wildly. The 2 sisters were being held together. That meant they wanted to use both of them as bait, and Rosalie knew exactly who they were trying to lure. At that same moment, in the 4th floor apartment on the south side, Knox burst in, his face drained of color. Tristan had been sitting there reading the report Knox had sent earlier, but the moment he saw the look on his right-hand man's face, he knew something was wrong. "Something's happened," Knox said, his voice urgent. "They've got her, Rosalie, and her sister too. Both of them disappeared a few hours ago. Our people at the hospital reported back. The cameras were turned off at the exact moment she stepped into the elevator. This was organized." Tristan rose so suddenly that the chair behind him crashed to the floor. He stood there for a second, his entire body trembling. Knox had followed Tristan for years. He had seen Tristan in the most dangerous situations, facing the most vicious enemies, but he had never seen him like this. Tristan's eyes were bloodshot, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His jaw was locked hard, the muscles in his face twitching. This wasn't the cold anger Tristan usually carried. This was fury. The fury of a man on the verge of losing the most precious thing in his life. "Who?" Tristan asked, his voice low, as though it had risen from hell itself. "Who did this?" Knox swallowed. "Marcus Webb. And there's intelligence suggesting Celeste is working with him." Tristan was silent for a moment. Then he spoke again, and now his voice no longer shook. It had become cold as ice. "Mobilize everyone, every man, every resource. I want to know where they're holding her within 1 hour." Knox nodded, but still said, "You understand this could be a trap, don't you? They want to lure you out." Tristan looked at Knox, his eyes dark as a moonless night. "I don't care," he said, each word deliberate. "If even a single hair on her head is harmed, I'll burn all of Chicago to the ground, and I'll start with Marcus Webb." Knox said nothing more. He turned and left the apartment, already moving to carry out the order. Tristan stood in the middle of the room, staring out at the black window. Rosalie, she was out there somewhere, frightened, alone, because of him, because she had known him. He closed his eyes, and Rosalie's face rose before him. Her smile, the hot bowl of porridge she brought him every night, the way she had held him on the night of his nightmare, the way she had said, "I'm not afraid of you." And that night, the darkness truly woke. In that dim room, time passed with the slow cruelty of torture. Rosalie had no idea how many hours had gone by since she woke up. There were no windows, no natural light, only a weak bulb hanging from the ceiling and 4 cold concrete walls closing around them. Willa sat in the corner of the room with her knees drawn up to her chest, her body trembling without stopping. She had cried until there were no tears left, and now only the sound of choked sobs broke the heavy silence. Rosalie sat down beside her sister and wrapped an arm around Willa's thin, shaking shoulders. "Don't be afraid," she said softly, trying to keep her voice calm even though her own heart was pounding wildly. "Someone will come. I promise you. Willa looked up at her, her eyes red and swollen, full of confusion. Who? She asked, her voice trembling. Do you know someone who can save us? They said we're bait. They want to lure someone here. Rosalie. Willa couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence, but Rosalie understood exactly what she meant. Rosalie was silent for a moment, looking down at the hand that was tightly holding her sister's. Then she smiled, a small smile, gentle but certain. Yes, she said, I know someone, and he will come. Who is he? Willa asked, a fragile spark of hope flickering in her eyes. Rosalie didn't answer directly. She only held her sister more tightly and whispered, He's the man they never should have touched. Outside, night had already fallen over Chicago. In an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district on the eastern side of the city, Marcus Webb and his people were waiting. Celeste stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, a triumphant smile resting on her lips. Everything was unfolding exactly according to plan. Tristan would come, and when he did, he would walk straight into the trap. But what she didn't know was that only a few blocks away, Tristan's convoy had already surrounded the entire area. Knox stood beside Tristan, looking down at the map on the tablet in his hands. 20 men inside, Knox reported in a low voice. They're holding her in the basement. There's only one main entrance and one emergency exit in the back. Tristan nodded, his eyes never leaving the building ahead. I'm going in, he said. Myself. Knox turned to look at him, his expression dark with concern. It's too dangerous, he objected. Let our team go in first. You stay here. No. Tristan cut him off, his voice allowing no argument. She's in there. She's frightened. She's waiting for me. He turned to look at Knox, his eyes like two burning coals in the dark. I can't stand out here and wait while she's in there. Knox held his gaze for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. He knew there was no stopping Tristan once he had decided something. At least let us create a distraction, Knox said. Give us 3 minutes. Exactly 3 minutes later, Tristan walked into the warehouse through the main entrance alone. He didn't try to hide, didn't try to sneak in. He moved with the calm authority of a man who owned the place, as though the building already belonged to him. Inside, the large room was lit by a few industrial lamps hanging high overhead. 20 men were scattered around the space, their eyes hard and threatening, ready to move at any moment. In the center of the room, Marcus Webb sat in a chair with one leg stretched out over the table, a smug smile on his lips. Celeste stood beside him, her eyes brightening the moment Tristan stepped inside. Tristan Wolfe, Marcus said, his voice full of mockery. I thought you were dead. Turns out you've been hiding with that little cook in the slums. Tristan didn't answer the taunt. He stood there in silence, cold and unreadable, his eyes sweeping once across the room. Then he spoke, his voice low and even. Where is she? Marcus laughed loudly. Straight to the point, aren't you? Not even a greeting? He got to his feet and began walking toward Tristan. Your girl is down in the basement. Safe. For now. He tilted his head, malice glittering in his eyes. Want her back? Easy. Kneel. Tristan looked at Marcus, his expression untouched by emotion. Then he let his eyes move once more around the room, counting the men, judging their positions. And then he smiled. It was a cold, terrible smile, more frightening than any spoken threat. I'm offering a different choice, Tristan said, his voice like ice. Open the basement door, walk out of here, and live. Or I'll walk through all of you, and you'll regret ever standing in my way. Marcus gave a scornful laugh. Who do you think you are? You're alone. I have 20. He never got to finish. An explosion thundered from outside. The rear door was blown open, and Tristan's men poured in like a flood. Chaos erupted in an instant, but Tristan didn't care about the fight breaking out around him. He moved like darkness itself, cutting through the disorder, heading straight for the door leading down to the basement. The basement door was locked. Tristan didn't hesitate. He kicked it open. Inside was a dark hallway, and at the end of it was a small room. He ran toward it and shoved the door wide open. And there she was. Rosalie and Willa were huddled together in the corner, their eyes wide with fear. When the light from the hallway spilled into the room, Rosalie lifted her head. She saw a figure standing in the doorway, backlit, tall and commanding. Rosalie, his voice came, deep and warm. She knew that voice. She knew that silhouette, and in that instant, tears filled her eyes. She looked up and saw him standing there against the light, like a god stepping out of the darkness. Rosalie looked at Tristan standing in the doorway, and everything inside her broke open at once. The fear, the worry, the waiting, all of it spilled out in tears she could no longer hold back. She let go of Willa, rose to her feet, and ran to him. She threw herself into his arms and held on to him tightly, as though she was afraid he would disappear if she let go. "You came," she sobbed, her voice thick with tears. "You really came. I knew you would come. I knew it." Tristan held her, his arms tightening around her slender body, and for the first time in his life, he trembled, not from fear for himself, but from fear of losing her. When he received the news that she had been taken, when he imagined what might happen to her, he had been afraid, truly afraid. The feeling was unfamiliar to him. A man who had lived his whole life never knowing what fear was. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, his voice rough and broken. "I let you be in danger. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Rosalie shook her head, still holding him tightly. "Don't apologize. You came. That's enough. You came." Willa stood behind them, staring in confusion at her sister crying in the arms of a strange man. She didn't understand what was happening. Who was this man? Why was her sister crying like that? Why was he holding her sister with eyes that looked as though she were the most precious thing in the world? "Rosalie," Willa said softly, her voice trembling. "Who is this?" Rosalie turned back to look at her sister, tears still on her cheeks, but she smiled. "He's the one I told you about," she answered. "The one who would come save us." Willa looked at Tristan, then back at her sister, still not fully understanding, but she had no chance to ask more, because Knox appeared at the door. "Things outside are under control," he reported. Then Knox looked at Willa, and his voice softened. "Come with me. I'll take you somewhere safe." Willa looked at her sister, and Rosalie nodded in reassurance. "Go with him, sweetheart. I'll be right behind you." Willa hesitated for a moment, then stepped after Knox and followed him out. Before she left, she turned back to look at Tristan one more time, her eyes still full of questions. But she said nothing. She only left in silence. When only the two of them remained in the dark room, Tristan took Rosalie's hand and led her outside. They walked through the hallway, through the large room that had now fallen quiet, and out to where the line of cars was waiting. Tristan opened the car door and let Rosalie climb in first, then sat down beside her. The car rolled into the night, streetlights sliding across the windows. Rosalie sat beside Tristan, still holding tightly to his hand, as though she feared that if she let go, everything would turn out to be only a dream. A long silence passed. Then suddenly Rosalie turned to him, and the relief in her eyes shifted into anger. "Do you have any idea you could have?" she began, her voice shaking with emotion. "You walked in there alone, 20 men. You could have. What if something had happened to you?" Tristan looked at her, his eyes gentle. "You were worried about me?" he asked, sounding almost surprised. "Of course I was worried," Rosalie nearly shouted. "Are you crazy? That was reckless. Weren't you thinking about yourself at all? Weren't you thinking about—" She couldn't finish. Tears spilled over again. She couldn't bear the thought of him not coming back. She couldn't imagine a world without him in it. Tristan tightened his hand around hers and gently interrupted her. "Rosalie," he said, his voice low and slow. "All my life I've had nothing to lose. I lived like a shadow. No feeling, no fear, not caring whether I lived or died." He looked into her eyes, and his gaze burned like live coals. "But now, for the first time in my life, I have a reason to live." He paused, and his voice softened as though he were confessing the greatest secret of his life. "It's you," Rosalie cried, unable to say a word. She could only look at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. No one had ever spoken to her that way before. No one had ever looked at her that way. She was only a poor cook, an ordinary girl living an ordinary life. There was nothing special about her. But in the eyes of the most powerful man in Chicago, she was a reason to live. Tristan leaned closer to her and lifted his hand, gently wiping away the tears on her cheeks. His hand was warm and tender, the complete opposite of the cold image he always showed the world. "I don't know what love is," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I've never loved anyone. I've never truly been loved by anyone." He looked into her eyes, and there was something in them she had never seen before. "But if this is love, this feeling, Then I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose you. Rosalie looked at him, her eyes red, her heart beating wildly in her chest. Then she did the thing she had wanted to do for so long but had never dared. She leaned forward and gently pressed her lips to his. Their first kiss. Soft as the touch of a butterfly wing against a flower petal, trembling like hearts that were just learning how to love, full of tears, full of all the emotion they had been holding back, and yet it was the most beautiful kiss of their lives. When they pulled apart, Tristan looked at her, his eyes softer than they had ever been. Rosalie smiled through her tears. I don't want to lose you either, she whispered. Don't ever risk your life like that again. Don't ever leave me alone. That night, the darkness was no longer alone, because the light had chosen to stay. 3 months had passed since the night of that rescue. 3 months in which Rosalie's life had changed completely, in ways she had never even dared to dream of. Her mother, Margaret, had been moved by Tristan to the best hospital in Chicago, where the leading team of heart specialists had taken over her care. After 2 months of treatment and surgery, she had recovered completely, her cheeks pink again, her smile bright. No longer the frail mother once confined to a hospital bed, Willa was safe as well, fully freed from the people who had held her after that night. Now she was preparing her applications for one of the most prestigious universities in the country, with a full scholarship quietly arranged by Tristan. As for Marcus Webb and his men, after that night, they had vanished entirely from Chicago. No one knew exactly what had happened to him. People only knew that he was no longer a threat. Celeste had been stripped of everything too, from her money to her status to the powerful connections she had once relied on. She had nothing left now, and during those 3 months, Tristan and Rosalie made an important decision. They were going to get married. The wedding was held on a private island in the Caribbean, an island Tristan had bought for Rosalie as a wedding gift. When Rosalie first saw it from the helicopter, she could hardly believe her eyes. A long stretch of white sand, turquoise water, rows of palm trees bending in the wind, and at the center of the island, a large villa with modern architecture that still felt warm and welcoming. "You're insane," she had said, her eyes wide. "Who buys an entire island as a wedding gift?" Tristan had only smiled. "The man who loves you." On the wedding day, the island was filled with guests. Chicago's elite, powerful financiers, the most influential figures in the underworld, all of them were there. They had come not only because they wanted to congratulate Tristan Wolfe, but because they were curious. The man they had once believed dead was not only alive, but was now hosting the grandest wedding Chicago had ever seen. And the question on everyone's lips was the same. Who is the bride? What kind of woman could make Tristan Wolfe, a man who never believed in love, hold a wedding like this? When the wedding music began, every guest turned toward the aisle, and then they saw the bride, Margaret, Rosalie's mother, now completely healed, cheeks glowing and smile radiant, walked her daughter down the aisle. Rosalie wore a pure white wedding dress, simple but elegant, needing no diamonds or jewels to shine. She shone by being herself, by the happiness in her smile, by the love in her eyes, as she looked toward Tristan waiting for her at the end of the aisle. Beside her walked Willa as maid of honor, her young face glowing, no trace left of the frightened girl she had once been. The guests were stunned. They had imagined every kind of bride, the daughter of some billionaire, some famous star, the heiress of a powerful family. But the woman walking down the aisle was an ordinary girl, with no famous name, no family power, nothing at all except her smile and her eyes full of love. The whispers began at once. "Who is she? I heard she's a cook." "That can't be right. Tristan Wolfe is marrying a cook?" And in the corner of the room, Celeste stood there, having secretly slipped in just to see the bride with her own eyes. She had not been invited, but she had needed to witness it herself. When she saw Rosalie walking in, Celeste went pale, the girl with the porridge, the girl she had once called the maid. And now, that same girl was walking down the aisle as Tristan Wolfe's bride. Tristan stood at the end of the aisle, his eyes never leaving Rosalie. When she reached him, he took her hand and held it tightly. Then he began to speak his vows, his voice low and slow, each word sounding as if it were being carved into stone. "I used to be darkness," he said. "I didn't believe in light. I didn't believe in love. I thought I would live my whole life in that darkness, alone, needing no one." He paused and looked into her eyes. "But then you came, with a hot bowl of porridge, with a stubbornness that didn't know fear, with a heart that asked nothing of me except that I be myself. He held her hand more tightly. You saved me, Rosalie, before I ever had the chance to save you. You pulled me out of the darkness when I didn't even know I needed to be saved. He smiled, that rare smile only she ever got to see. From today on, I'm no longer darkness, because I have you, the light of my life, Rosalie cried, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. She squeezed his hand tightly and answered in a trembling voice, I didn't save you. I was only here. I only knocked on your door, brought a bowl of porridge, and refused to leave no matter how many times you sent me away. She laughed through her tears. And I'll be here, forever, I promise. In the corner of the room, Celeste stood watching the scene, tears running down her cheeks, not tears of joy, but the tears of someone who had lost everything. She had once had Tristan in her hands for 3 whole years. She had once had the chance to be loved, to have everything that girl now had. But she had chosen betrayal. She had chosen money instead of love, and now she stood there with no money, no status, no anything, watching the man she had betrayed speak words of love to an ordinary girl. And the girl with the porridge, the poor cook Celeste had once despised, was now becoming the mistress of an entire empire. And those who had once looked down on the poor girl now had to bow their heads to the new lady of Chicago. 1 year after the wedding, Rosalie's life was completely different. She was no longer the hired cook who had once been shouted at by her manager and forced to work 3 shifts a day just to earn every last dollar. Now she owned a lovely little restaurant in the heart of Chicago, a restaurant called Light, the dream she had carried in her heart since childhood but had never dared believe could become real. The restaurant wasn't large, and it wasn't luxurious, but it was warm and full of love. Rosalie cooked every dish with her own hands and cared for every small detail herself, and every evening, when the restaurant was nearing closing time, there was one special guest sitting at the corner table. Tristan Wolfe, the most powerful man in Chicago, sat there like an ordinary customer, eating the food his wife had made, waiting for her to finish work, and then going home with her. The staff at the restaurant had grown used to the sight. They were no longer afraid of the cold, powerful man, because they had seen the way he looked at Rosalie, the way he smiled when she brought out his food, the way he held her hand when they walked out the door together. Rosalie's mother, Margaret, was now completely healthy and lived with them in the grand mansion. She often teased her son-in-law with playful humor. Back then my daughter brought porridge to you. Now you have to come eat the meals my daughter cooks for you every night. Seems fair to me. Tristan only laughed and never argued back. He liked being teased that way. He liked the feeling of having a family. Willa was far away at university now, but she still called home every week, showing off her high grades, talking about her new friends, talking about the bright, colorful life she was building as a student. Every time Rosalie heard the happiness in her sister's voice, she smiled. She had done it. She had kept her promise to her mother, to her sister, and to herself. One night, after the restaurant had closed, Rosalie sat across from Tristan at their usual table. She looked at him for a long moment, then pulled a piece of paper from her coat pocket and placed it in front of him. Look, she said, her voice trembling a little. Tristan frowned and picked up the paper. He looked at it and then froze. It was an ultrasound image, a tiny blurry shape on the page, but he knew at once what it was. He looked at the paper, then at Rosalie, then back at the paper again. His lips moved, but no sound came out. You mean? He finally stammered. Rosalie smiled, and tears began to run down her cheeks. You're going to be a father, she said, her voice thick with emotion but overflowing with happiness. We're going to have a baby. Silence filled the room. Tristan sat there, staring at the paper in his hand, unable to say a single word. Then something happened that Rosalie had never expected. Tristan cried. Tears rolled down the face of the man who had never cried in front of anyone. For the first time in his life, he wasn't crying from pain, or anger, or loss. He was crying from happiness, and from fear. I'm afraid, he whispered, his voice shaking. I'm afraid I'll become like my father. Afraid I'll hurt our child. Afraid I won't know how to be a father. Rosalie stood, walked around the table, sat beside him, and wrapped her arms around him. She held him the way she had held him on the night of his nightmare, gently, warmly, with all the love in her heart. You won't be like your father, she said softly but with certainty, because you're afraid of becoming like him, because you know how to love, because you know how to cherish what matters. She took his hand and placed it on her belly, and because you have me, I'll be beside you, always. We'll learn how to be parents together. Together. Tristan held his wife tightly, his face buried against her shoulder. Then he lifted his eyes and looked toward the ceiling, as though he were looking at someone very far away. "Mom," he whispered, his voice light as breath, "I found someone like you. Someone gentle, strong, and someone who never walks away from me no matter who I am." He closed his eyes, tears still resting on his cheeks. "I won't repeat my father's mistakes. I promise you, Mom. I'll be a good father. I'll love my child the way you loved me." Rosalie held his hand tightly and kept it resting on her stomach, where a tiny life was growing. "We'll do it together," she said. "Forever." And that is the story of darkness learning how to love, of a monster finding his angel, of an ordinary girl who brought a bowl of porridge to a stranger, and without meaning to, changed an entire empire. True love doesn't need to know what you have. True love only needs to know who you are. Thank you for staying with this story until the very last moment. If your heart was moved, if you felt warmth, emotion, or simply want to support our channel, please press the like button and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next stories, the ones that will continue to touch the deepest parts of your soul. We would truly love to hear how you felt. What did you think of this story? Which moment moved you the most? Please leave a comment below and share the thoughts rising from the deepest part of your heart. Every comment you leave is a great source of encouragement for us to keep bringing you even better stories. And finally, we wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness each day. May love and light always come to you, just as light came to Tristan in this story. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.